He's a Navy veteran, pastor, and husband of Chris Ann Hall. That's a job, man. Where's he at? JC, where are you at? There he is. Please welcome JC Hall.
All right. Appreciate everybody turning out today. I'm going to have to agree with Wild Bill rather than my wife. It's difficult for me to preach a sermon where I talk about liberals and not use the word idiot. Amen. We all know America's not perfect, but how many still believe America is an exceptional nation? Well, this month, 240 years ago, a preacher opened up his church in Richmond, Virginia. And in his church, over 100 leaders gathered, including George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, to listen to a fiery attorney in the church tell them that Americans had begged and petitioned long enough, and it was time to stand up and fight for liberty, that their fellow Americans were already in the streets fighting as he spoke. And from the pulpit of this church, as the preacher amened him from the pew, this fiery lawyer passionately declared, "I know not what course other men may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Amen. I wonder what this attorney and those patriots that sat in that church that day would think about the churches of our day. I think one of our brother earlier said we ought to have 4,000 people out here. I think a lot of them ought to be church members and preachers and believers. Amen. Ought to be filling this place. But so many in our churches, far from crying enough is enough, sit silently and actually teach believers in the churches that we're supposed to sit and we can't push back, and we can pray for the government, but you certainly couldn't disobey a law, and you certainly don't need to be involved in politics. And this poisonous teaching has gotten into the minds of believers and gotten into the minds of so many Americans that the church and believers are practically disengaged from the fight for liberty. Amen. And these folks sit with their nose pointed toward the sky, waiting for Jesus to return, while neglecting the very gifts of liberty that he's given them and commanded them to be good stewards of. And I think that is a shame. Amen. They sit and falsely teach that Romans 13, where it says that Christians should submit to lawful authority, also includes tyrannical, immoral, and lawless government. Amen. Something that was never believed by the church for centuries. Preachers say don't push back, yet in Exodus chapter 1 we see the Hebrew midwives standing up and saying we will not comply with government mandated abortions. Amen. And then God responds and blesses them and commends them. Amen. Our preachers today say we can't resist, yet one of their prophets, who by the way was a highly placed politician, you know him by the name of Daniel the prophet. Go check out Daniel chapter 6. He was also Daniel the politician. Yep. The king divided the province up into 120 kingdoms, appointed governors over those, and then a 3-man council to govern those, and chief among those was Daniel. Daniel the prophet, Daniel the politician, broke the law and said, I will not comply with this legislative act that these 120 governors had passed and the king's stamp. And Daniel said, I will not comply with the law that says I can only worship the king. Daniel threw open his windows. He said, I will not hide my faith from the public square. I'm going to pray 3 times a day out my window so you know who I'm praying to. You can hear who I'm praying to. Yet we have preachers that use the excuse of separation in church and state to tell their parishioners, their congregation that, well, I can't talk about this and you should not either. Whereas our founders put the principle of separation in church and state and sewed it in the First Amendment into our Constitution, which meant government had no business in the church. It did not mean that God had no place in the public square. But these cowardly preachers say that we have to bow down and submit with whatever the government says. Yet the three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as the king built an idol and said, you must worship the idol, these three young boys said, you know what, we may burn, but we will not bow. Make all the idols you want to, hire all the bands, play all the music you want to, but God is with us, He will fight for us. We may burn, but we will not bow. That's the kind of preachers we need today. And I'm telling you, God was so impressed with them resisting the civil authority with their tyrannical decrees that God in the flesh joined them in the fire. I would like to know how so-called men of God can preach such wicked doctrine. How can we suggest a blind submission, a slavish submission to wicked, tyrannical, immoral, and lawless government?
That's right.
Are we to assume that Martin Luther King Jr., he was the wicked man resisting tyrannical, immoral law? Are they suggesting that Rosa Parks was the bad guy? Are we to believe that all the veterans that poured onto the shores of France fighting an evil, tyrannical government, that they were the bad guys? You know, it used to be some of what Bill mentioned, these old westerns. He reminded me of it. Used to be we'd watch those old westerns and the good guy had the white hat and the bad guy had the black hat. And it was pretty clear who was on the right side. And we got a bunch of preachers in our pulpits that are crippled too high for crutches apparently, that can't tell the difference between good and evil.
That's right.
I'm here to tell you, folks like Stalin, folks like Hitler, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Kim Jong-il, they're amening those wicked sermons from those cowardly preachers. Our God demands that we stand for righteousness. How ironic it is. My wife was teaching the other day in a Christian privately funded library, public lending library. And I walked out and I saw on the shelf this book, and on the front of it, it said, God's Outlaw. And I thought, wow, that's right up my alley. And I opened the book and I said, wow. It was a biography about William Tyndale. And I thought, is this what's called irony? We have preachers all of America standing with their Bibles open, telling people you got to do whatever the government says do because that's what the Bible said. And the very Bible that they hold is based on the work of an outlaw translator.
Amen.
I guess they've never seen Fox's Book of Martyrs that goes throughout this whole tale of people being thrown in the Colosseum, eaten by lions, people being burnt at the stake for the very reason that they resisted tyrannical government and resisted immoral laws. Our entire faith is built upon the righteous resistance of civil authority that has become tyrannical. And we need some preachers to reconnect with their Bible, reconnect with their history, stand up in our pulpits, stop being loyal to your 501c3, stop worshiping money, fear God more than you love your wallet. Stand up and tell people the truth. Are we loving our neighbors as the Lord commanded while our neighbors are being spied upon, while our neighbors are being oppressed, while their emails are being violated, while people are having no-knock raids and warrantless searches? Are we loving our neighbor when innocents are being slaughtered every day? Are we loving our neighbor when wicked government stands and engages in unrighteousness all around us and oppresses our fellow citizens? That, my friend, is not loving your neighbor as yourself. That is wicked. They are the sinners, not the ones resisting evil. Are we loving our neighbor as we stand and say nothing to the suggestion of universal gun registration, which was a prelude in Nazi Germany to the extermination of 6 million Jews? Is that what these preachers would call righteous and loving your neighbor? I say, perhaps preachers should take an oath. rather than just giving lip service to the Bible.
That's right, brother.
Perhaps they should stand and swear an oath that they're going to preach the full counsels of God.
Amen.
Perhaps they should take an oath that said we're going to stand for righteousness no matter where we have to stand. Perhaps they should take an oath and say we're going to resist tyrants and we're going to resist evil. It doesn't matter if that evil person is made to be an elected citizen. Evil is evil no matter where you find it. And no matter where it is, we have an obligation before God to resist and not bow.
Amen.
So I want to challenge preachers and call on preachers and the people of God. Stop hiding behind your 501c3. Stop worshiping the almighty dollar and bow before Almighty God.
Amen.
And I want to leave this challenge not just to preachers, because I don't know how many are here, but I know we're here. And maybe there's some believers out here. Maybe there's some churchgoers out here. I want to challenge you. I believe that the church in America needs a new exodus.
Amen.
We need a new exodus of God's people. If that man who's calling himself a shepherd is too cowardly to speak on issues that matter, then you should come out.
Amen, brother.
If that so-called pastor loves his wallet more than he loves God, you should come out.
Amen.
If that preacher is too scared, claiming we don't need to offend anybody because we'll offend those that we're trying to reach. Those that you're trying to reach are being oppressed by evil, and they see people calling themselves Christians standing by and doing nothing. What sort of testimony to the principles of God is that? What sort of gospel testimony is that?
That's good.
And if your preacher, so-called, is too scared to stand up for what's right and too scared to preach out, I say come out from among them and be ye separate.
Amen.
We need a revival in this nation of truth. We need a revival in this nation of liberty. And I'm going to tell you this one thing as I travel and hear people talk about this issue and put it into a political context of right versus left and Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative. And I hear we need more conservatives. I see a lot of people calling themselves conservatives. I believe what we need, more than we need conservatives, is we need people who are courageous.
Amen.
We don't need a revival of conservatism. We need a revival of courage. It's time for people to stand up and be counted. I believe as God told Esther, He sent us into the kingdom. And let's face it, that's what we've become. He sent us into the kingdom for such a time as this. And I believe for the purpose of transforming this fundamentally transformed kingdom back into the constitutional republic that God enabled our founders to give to us. And I think it's time for God's people and God's preachers to stand up and defend the gifts of liberty and be good stewards for that. Let's have an American exodus. Let's find people who are standing for truth, who are standing for liberty, and let's leave these cowardly idolaters standing in these false pulpits by themselves. And I think I'm supposed to introduce you to my beautiful wife. She taught me how to give these good speeches. But I have the privilege of being married to Chris Ann Hall. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but Chris Ann is a constitutional attorney. She's a former prosecutor that was fired for teaching the Constitution on her own time. Welcome to a fundamentally transformed America. And now, ever since then, her left-wing radical boss said, you can either teach the Constitution or you can work for me. And I'm so proud of this lady who stood and said, you know what, you did not give me my rights and I'm not going to surrender them to you for a paycheck. And now she travels the Constitution teaching it all over the United States. She's been teaching for the last 5 years. She teach about 265 groups in 22 states last year alone. Well, just about every year we've averaged that. And by the grace of God, we're going to continue doing that. And as she has said before, this is not a fame ministry, this is a faith ministry. And we believe that God has intended for America for a revival of liberty, and come what may, we want to be on His side. I don't know what your decision is, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Ann Hall.
I hope that I am proof that you don't have to be a one-eyed old fat guy to love the Constitution. I am an educator by nature. That is what I do. I travel around the country and I teach what we have failed to teach for generations. If we think that changing out the guy in the White House is going to fix our problems, we don't know what our problems really are. If we think that there's a difference between the Republicans and the Democrats when their establishments are in line, we don't know what the problems really are. And I believe that one of the greatest obstacles that we as Americans face today is the fundamental level of ignorance that we share across this country about the establishment, the purpose, the meaning, and the directives of the Constitution of the United States. We are filled with oath takers. My goodness, you can't even be a dog collector today without taking the oath to support the Constitution of the United States, which it ought to be. Problem is, I got a funny way of thinking. I'm just thinking, if you're going to be an oath taker, you ought to be an oath keeper. But how do you keep an oath when you have absolutely no idea what it means? I mean, our courtrooms are infested with people who have no understanding of the Constitution whatsoever, because we don't teach the Constitution in law school. We teach constitutional law, which teaches that men and women in black robes know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it, because after all, they're a bunch of dead guys who wrote some outdated, irrelevant documents, and we need the judges and the lawyers to go into our courtrooms and pool their own ignorance and redefine and transform who we really are. They want to call our Constitution the supreme law of the land, which, if we were actually going to be speaking correctly, is the supreme contract of the land. They want to take that supreme contract of the land, that agreement between the states, and call it a living, breathing document. But I want you to find one of them who would volunteer to have their employment contracts interpreted that way. It won't happen. Because you see, when we allow them to alter what the contract means, we transform fundamentally the very foundations of who we are. Hosea chapter 4 verse 6 says, "My people perish for lack of knowledge, and we are being destroyed for our lack of knowledge." Are you sick and tired of an out-of-control federal government?
Amen. Yeah.
Because you see, that wasn't loud enough, because I don't think you're actually sick and tired of it yet.
Amen.
Do you think this federal government is completely out of control?
Amen.
Well, that's more like it. Are you sick and tired of the executive branch writing law, overturning law, setting aside law, and even promising to do more?
Yeah.
Let me let you in on a little secret. You don't have a president problem. That's a Congress problem. The fact that the executive branch is stealing congressional power by writing law and overturning it, setting aside it based on who their biggest donors are and their favorite lobbyists may be, is not a presidential problem. That is a congressional problem, because our founders knew that too much power vested in the executive branch would lead to a tyrannical king, so they vested the most amount of power in the federal government within the Congress, the House of Representatives, the direct representatives of the people, the Senate, the direct representatives of the states. And they were in charge of keeping this man under control when they knew by nature, human nature, he would want to be king. Our Congress has become a failure to their oath. They have become complicit in the destruction of our Constitution by their failure to act and their failure to maintain their duty under Article 2, Section 4, impeaching those who destroy the Constitution, and Article 1, Section 7, the power of the purse vested in the hands of the House of Representatives alone, with the power to defund every single rogue action this tyrant in chief keeps establishing.
Amen.
Richard Benson's a traitor.
Every person in the House of Representatives who has voted in favor of any of these budgets for the last 12 years is a traitor to the Constitution of the United States, is selling your children into slavery and debt. They are violations of their oath. They are not oath keepers. They are oath breakers, and they have no problem lying to your face, and it makes no difference what magic letter is behind their name. Every single one of these budgets gives you a plan. We will cut the deficit over the next 10 years. We will limit our spending over the next 10 years. You will gladly pay us. We will gladly pay you Tuesday for all our spending today. And we have ended up with a wimpy government selling our children into debt and slavery while they stuff their pockets with richness, they stuff their brains with egos, and they lead us into slavery and tyranny. Amen. There is not a single budget ever written that Congress is required to follow for 10 years. Do you know why we only need the House of Representatives to pass a budget? Go read Article 1, Section 7. The power of the purse was placed in the hands of the House alone for a reason. It says the Senate may offer amendments, but they don't have to. This whole dog and pony show thing we see every year while the Senate does this and the House wrings their hands. Oh, what are we going to do? Oh, what are we going to do when the Senate won't go along with us? I guess we'll just have to give in and fund all of these unconstitutional agencies, or the government will shut down. You know what I say? Shut her down. But the Senate is involved in that process necessarily, and the president has no say. You know why? Because it's not a law. Your budget is not a law. Your budget expires every year. Laws don't expire. And every time your budget expires, we get a new crisis to distract us from the real tyranny that's before us. We get to stand for those champions who want to save America by selling us into slavery and lying to our faces. No Congress in the future is ever bound by a budget that's been passed by the current Congress. And when they look you in the eye and tell you, we will cut this budget, we will cut our spending, we will reduce this deficit over the next 10 years, they are oath breakers and they are liars, and that makes them wicked. Amen. Congress, with their little dog and pony shows they call congressional hearings, where we get to load up people on pedestals and say, wow, he's real good at talking real mean to those nasty liberals. When was the last time you actually saw them do something? I call it the shuffle and jive, right? Look at me. I'm doing something. I'm calling people out. I'm calling Hillary Clinton a criminal. I'm calling Eric Holder a criminal. Look at me. I'm doing something. In the meantime, they're not doing anything at all, but being false prophets, creating a situation where the people of America fall in love by cult of personality worship, people who are leading us into servitude. I have come to understand that America is suffering from Stockholm syndrome. We have fallen in love with our captors. You know where I get my biggest criticism from? It's amazing because I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter. I have a radio show that I broadcast 6 days a week, podcasted on my website 5 days a week. I don't get attacked by liberal trolls. Do you know who attacks me? The Republicans. I get more attack from the Republicans than I do from the Democrats because, hey, I'm not saying anything that ain't true about the Democrats. As a matter of fact, when I talk about them, they're proud of the things that they've done. But when I call out these Republicans, who, by the way, in their party platform called themselves the party of the Constitution, are actively destroying the Constitution, and I'm showing you that, I am told, Chris-Ann, you can't eat your own. Let me make something very, very clear. They are not my own. I have no kinship with anyone who can smile at me and destroy my liberty with the same mouth and the same body. And America needs to wake up and see that there is no difference in politics. My favorite founding mother, her name is Mercy Otis Warren. She wrote a history book about her politics, and she called them all prostitutes for power. How about our Supreme Court of the United States? You have no hope in the Supreme Court of the United States. They're the ones that said health care is a power that's rightly wielded by the federal government. Not only that, our most conservative guy on the Supreme Court said that the EPA can regulate carbon emissions without even recognizing one time that the EPA does not even constitutionally exist. Hey, I'm just trying to show you the federal government is not going to fix itself. It is not the source of all the solutions of our problems in America. They are the source of all the problems in America. And the only way we are going to fix this, if we get the proper perspective on government, we turn our backs on this federal circus and start focusing local. I want to read something to you really quickly. I'm going to read it to you so you know I'm not lying to you, okay? This is the last paragraph to the Declaration of Independence. Now, you remember the Declaration of Independence starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Declaring right then and there, we are not a kingdom, we are a republic, because we don't need permission from the king, because we have the authority of the people. And they said, whenever any government operates contrary to those means, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish them.
Amen.
Yeah.
Alter, or it's your right, it is your duty. Here, I want to read to you this last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, because I want you to know, I know, as we all must know, that the solution to an out-of-control federal government was designed by our founders. They knew we would become pacified in prosperity. They knew we would become lazy in luxury. And they knew at that moment the government would step up and enslave us. And they wanted to design a solution for us to fix that problem when it happens. They said, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions due, and in the name and by the authority of the good people, not the king, of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. We did not break free from the tyranny of Great Britain to simply create 13 little colonies that were now going to be formed into a kingdom called the United States. We created 13 independent, free, sovereign states who held the same power. When you finish reading here in the Declaration of Independence, each and every state carried the same power and authority as Great Britain, France, and Spain. That word state is not synonymous with colony. It is synonymous with independent, free, sovereign country. We are not subjects to the federal government. We are its master. We are a republic where the federal government is the colony, and the states and the people are the kings. Now, the people, all the authority comes from the people, because there's one thing I want to throw in here real quick. You must recognize that your state can become tyrannical too. That's why maintaining this oath is so important. Our solution is not in the federal government. Our solution lies in understanding that the majority of the power rests in the states and local government. Hey, you know what? If the world was perfect, according to Chris Ann Hall, we would completely ignore the federal government for 6 years. Every election dollar, every election minute would be dedicated to electing a constitutionally minded school board. You have a constitutionally minded school board, you don't care about Common Core, it's not coming. You get a constitutionally minded city council and county commission, Agenda 21 will be something everybody else is suffering and dealing with, because your constitutionally minded local government will understand how wicked and evil that is. You have, in 4 years, you can have a constitutionally minded sheriff, which I'm wondering, why ain't he here today? You get a constitutionally minded sheriff, and you will understand what liberty really feels like. Because if you have a constitutionally minded sheriff, the sheriff knows the EPA, the FBI, the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Land, the Bureau of Land Management, and every other one of these unconstitutional executive agencies has no power in your sheriff's jurisdiction. Amen. After 4 years, you will have created a crucible of government-trained people who are constitutionally minded oath keepers, and you can send them to your state governments, and then you will understand that the federal government can be under control. Because a state government that is constitutionally minded knows they have the duty, they have the obligation to keep the federal government within its prescribed, limited, and defined boundaries. And they know they have the power to say, hey, feds, we are not your colonies, we are not your subjects, we are your masters, and you cannot steal our power and use it. And if you try, it has no force here. But you want to know the dirty little secret? The dirty little secret is this. The feds don't want you to know. The feds don't have the manpower or the resources to enforce their tyrannical laws and regulations. They rely on co-opting the states and local governments to do it for them. Kansas proved that when they passed their Second Amendment Preservation Act and then wrote a letter to Eric Holder and told him, if you think you can take our guns, why don't you just come on and give it a shot? Because the last time I checked, we're not seeing federal troops running into Kansas on CNN. You know why? Because we, America, needs to know, not just here, but in our hearts, that the federal government is nothing but a bunch of hot air, a bunch of juvenile schoolyard bullies, and it's about time we take the power from the bullies and put it back in our states. I'm dreaming of a day where health care is something that is settled on the local and state level. I am dreaming of a day where schools are run by parents instead of bureaucrats. I am dreaming of a day where liberty prevails. And I am dreaming of a day where we, the Americans, say, we are independent, we are free, and we hold these truths to be self-evident. Where we have the courage to stand and say, we are the masters of the government, we are not your subjects. We will no longer tolerate your tyranny, we will no longer submit to your rule of law. We will now stand for our children so they don't have to, and we will not comply. Because then and only then will we really know what liberty is all about. Let's just not be oath takers. Today, let's all be oath keepers. Because our children are relying on us to defend liberty for them. Let's create America that God can bless again. Let's be a blessable nation. Thank you.